If I didn't know any better, I would think that the Apostle Paul is telling believers not to obey the Torah in Galatians chapter 4. But that's not what is happening. So let's take a look. If we are going to understand Galatians 4, I think there are three historical things that we all should understand before we dive into the text. Item number one is that there is this Roman law that says that you basically have no legal rights as a child until you are emancipated and adopted. So in Roman law, it didn't work like this all the time, but when a child came of age, usually around the age of 14, before that, they were like slaves, no rights, not an heir. Sure, they had a place at the papa's table, but that was about it. But then they would be emancipated, kind of like let go, but then adopted as a son or daughter with all the rights and privileges thereof. And so that's what the Apostle Paul wants of the Galatian believers. He wants them to go through adoption, that they might have the Spirit. Number two is that the Apostle Paul doesn't want the Jewish believers or the Gentile believers to fall back into old patterns. So they had these things called the elementary things of the world. And I think just to make it short, there was something called Gnosticism. It was like this special knowledge way of knowing things. In the Jewish community, it was like this amalgamation of both following the Torah, but also mixing that with Hellenistic mysticism. And then for the Gentiles who grew up in a pagan Roman context, there was no Torah. It was just bowing down to the imperial cult, whatever that might be. For the most part, it was Rome, but you also had local gods, and it was just full of polytheism. And they had special days and times and seasons and years and all that, and the Apostle Paul doesn't want them to fall into that. And then number three, I must tell you that I am completely sympathetic for the Gentile believers. You know, here they are in Galatia, and they are really between a rock and a hard place. And the Apostle Paul is recognizing they have kind of these two options, and he only wants them to go with option number three. The first option is this, is that they become a legal Jew. You see, the Jews, they had a certain right in a Roman context to gather. They could follow Jewish law or follow oral Torah or the Torah, and they could collect money. And if you were a legal Jew, you could just do that, and you didn't have to do any of the imperial cult stuff. And then you could fall back into your old ways and just say, you know, I'm going to go ahead and do the pagan holidays and, do the pagan rigmarole, but my heart's not in it. So, it's just kind of a cultural thing, so it's really no big deal. And that's way 1 and 2. The Apostle Paul says, either way, it's not good. And of course, there's a recourse there. You might be imposed upon in some way by the Roman government. You could be ostracized by your community. And that was just tough. And the third way that the Apostle Paul wants them to choose is don't become a proselyte and do not fall back into your own pagan patterns. Instead, just do what Yahweh has asked you to do and trust him no matter what, and know that you are adopted as sons and daughters, and you believe on faith, and you just move forward. It's scary, but that's kind of part of the Christian life. It's just kind of scary. Now, we should have faith. There is no fear, but I'm not going to lie that sometimes persecution can just be, scary. So let me go through verse by verse and unpack it, and I'll just kind of do it quickly, but it'll be enough for you to go and do further study on your own. And so the Apostle Paul in Galatians 4, verse 1 says, "Now I say, as long as the heir is a child, he does not differ at all from a slave, although he is owner of everything." You got to remember in Galatians, the Apostle Paul is writing to both Jewish believers and Gentile believers in the Galatian church. And he is wanting those Gentile believers to know that whether you grew up in a pagan situation or in a Jewish situation, you both come to faith. You both are grafted in. You are both adopted as sons and daughters, not by your pedigree at all. It's that Yahweh adopts you because of what his son Jesus has done on the cross for us, and he raised from the dead. And we believe on that. So in the Jewish context, he's saying, hey, even though you have a place at the table, even though you have the oracles of God, even though you are in the lineage of Abraham, the bottom line is, until you are emancipated and adopted by faith in Jesus Christ, you are still a slave. You have no rights or privileges, even though you have a place at the table. Verse 2. But he is under guardians and managers until the date set by the Father. And so guardians will allude back to chapter 3, the idea of the pedagogos, the custodian. In Roman law, Roman parlance, there was this idea that you had a custodian for the heir. But then, once the person goes through the emancipation process and then they become adopted as sons or daughters, at that point, they have all the rights and privileges, but they might not be old enough or wise enough to manage their inheritance. And so there you have a manager. Verse 3. So also we, while we were children, were held in bondage under the elemental things of the world. So now Paul is identifying with his Jewish brothers and sisters, saying that he understands, because he too was raised in a form of Jewish mysticism. And so you have earth, wind, water, fire, you have different gods. And the Apostle Paul, even though he is always a monotheist, he understands his monotheism in the context of Hellenistic mysticism. And so he just says, I identify with that too. And I can't slip back into that, and neither should you. Verse 4, but when the fullness of the time came, God sent forth his son. Now this is a natural son. This would be Jesus, the one with all the rights and privileges, the one that Yahweh would hand over all authority, born of a woman. And so here is this Messiah, born of a virgin, born under law. Now this is where things get really messed up. It is difficult to understand Paul sometimes. And part of that reason is because whenever the Apostle Paul refers to the law, he uses the Greek word nomos. But we don't always know, except by context, if this is the law of life, the law of liberty, the oral Torah, the written Torah, the law of sin, the law of death, the law of life. So Paul is going to use nomos in all different kinds of ways. And I think it's important that you know that. And so the same is true with hupo, under the law. We don't know what kind of under the law are we talking about here. Now I'm just going to fast forward you and tell you in context that under the law here is that Yeshua is born under the law in the sense that he would be the Passover lamb. He is the expected Messiah. And he is also going to be born under the law in the sense that he is going to be the one that would take the condemnation for us and be our sacrifice. Now, how do I know that? How can I make that claim? It's because what the Apostle Paul is doing here is making a parallel argument. He's already made the argument for the first time in Galatians chapter 3. And it's like this. It's like if you've ever tried to convince someone of something, you might not just use one illustration. You might use two or three, all say the same thing, but you're not really sure what's going to click. And the same thing is going on here with the Apostle Paul. And so in verses 4, 5, and 6, there's a parallel passage in chapter 3, starting in verse 13. It says, Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law. In other words, what Paul is saying is that Yeshua came under the law to redeem us from the curse of the law. Having become a curse for us, it is written, cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree. And so he is going to pay the price under the law. The law is going to come, it came after us, but what happens is Yeshua is our substitute, and then instead of killing us, it killed him. But of course, Yeshua had the power over sin and death, and he was able to take all that and then raise from the dead. Then verse 14, in order that in Christ Jesus the blessing of Abraham might come to the Gentiles so that we would receive the promise of the Spirit through faith. Now, I read that part to you is because when we continue to read in chapter 4, he's going to come up with the same conclusion, that Yeshua came under the law to redeem you from the curse of the law, and now that you have believed in Jesus and the promise, you have the Spirit, and your spirit cries out, Abba, Father. So verse 5, so that he might redeem those under the law. Now, the word redeem here has a special connotation, and the connotation is that of a slave that has been redeemed by a person so that they might have their freedom, that we might receive the adoption as sons. And so this language is going back to the original part of the argument where the Apostle Paul is saying that, hey, even if you are a Jew by birth or a Gentile by birth, it doesn't matter. Of course, the Gentile didn't have a place at the table. They didn't have the Torah. They didn't have the background. But no matter what, if you believe on Jesus in the promise, that promised seed, then you can be adopted and you have all the rights and privileges of an adopted son or daughter. Verse 6, because you are sons, God has sent forth his Spirit, I just told you about that, of his Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. And what the Apostle Paul is doing here is he's continuing to tell them, you don't need to be a proselyte and have strength. Don't go back to your old ways of doing things, whether that be pagan ritual or being a proselyte, whatever that is. When you believed on faith in Jesus, in the promised seed, the Spirit came into your body and you cried out, Abba, Father. And the Torah began to be written on your heart. So it's true with me. When I gave my life to Jesus as my Savior, the law no longer condemned me. Instead, now it became a roadmap, a path to righteousness. And sure, I'm being sanctified by the Spirit, but the Spirit in me compels me to read the Scriptures, specifically my Father's instruction. I read the Torah, and then I do it because my spirit cries out, Abba, Father. And what do we do with our fathers? Well, if you want to be like your father, you say, how do I live life? I want to be righteous like you. And I want to live right. So tell me how to do it so I can do it. And then we read the Scriptures and then we go do it. Verse 7, therefore you are no longer a slave, but a son. And if a son, then an heir through God. And here, this is where the Apostle Paul is speaking specifically to the Gentiles who do not feel sometimes like they are, they're just hurting their heart because they don't feel like they're as good as the Jewish believers. Now, the Jewish believers should not be condescending to the Gentile believers, nor should the Gentile believers feel second rate. And the Apostle Paul is saying, if you believe on faith, you too are in the covenant. Full rights and privileges. So just know it and be happy. This is good news. Verse 8, however, at that time when you did not know God, you were slaves to those which by nature are no gods. And this is a reference to the polytheistic, Hellenistic, mystical rituals. And the Apostle Paul doesn't want them to fall back into that. Verse 9, but now that you have come to know God, or rather be known by God, and that's just him slipping in the idea that we really don't choose God, God chooses us, how is it that you turn back again to the weak and worthless elemental things? Now, this is the same thing if we go back up to verse 3, same kind of construction, same idea, and that is whether you come at Hellenistic mysticism from a Jewish standpoint via Gnosticism, or Hellenistic tendencies via practicing worship more in line with the imperial cult. It doesn't matter. These are elemental things, and Paul doesn't want them to be enslaved all over again. So he writes, to which you desire to be enslaved all over again. He's saying, don't do that. And then verse 10, You observe days and months and seasons and years. And this is where everyone gets into trouble, and they basically make the assumption that this is now the feast days of the Torah. No. The Apostle Paul practiced the feast days. The Acts 2 church practiced the feast days. The Apostle Paul in Acts 21, he does the law. In Romans, the first half of Romans is all about the Apostle Paul recognizing how good and spiritual the law is. He would literally have to be speaking out of two sides of his mouth to come up with any different conclusion here. But that is not what is happening. The Apostle Paul is merely telling them that all the surrounding nations, they have their own holidays, they have their own rituals, their own way of doing things. Don't fall back into those things. Instead, what you do is you know that you are a full covenant member, whether you're Jew or Gentile, by faith through the promised seed, Messiah Yeshua. And now the Spirit is in you. You cry out, Abba, Father. And now you trade the elementary things of the world. And now you walk in Yahweh's instruction, His Torah, as obedient children, as fully adopted sons and daughters. And that's what's going on in the first 10 verses. I've got a lot to do this week, so I'm going to see you in 2 weeks. I'll see you then.